Mark chapter 10, let's begin reading together at verse 46, shall we? Then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up. He is calling for you." Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering him, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. The rooster's crow announced the dawn of a new day. But for the man in the tattered robe, it began just like every other day had begun for more days than he cared to remember. Rising from his cot in the corner, he carefully felt his way across the room to a small box which he opened to reveal a crust of bread. That, along with a few swallows of water from a chipped cup on the nearby table, was the extent of his meager breakfast and constituted the only nourishment he was guaranteed for the rest of the day. Shuffling to the doorway, he retrieved his walking stick. There he paused for a moment, some nagging thought in the back of his mind reminding him that something was missing. Of course, his cloak. He mustn't forget his cloak. This long white garment with big red stripes had been issued to him by the Roman government, and it was the symbol of his legal license to beg. When people would walk by him as he sat with his hand outstretched, asking for assistance, the cloak assured them that he had a right to be there. Not only did that cloak identify him as legally permitted to beg, it also served as a blanket to keep him warm during the cold nights. When stretched out on the ground in front of him, it was the place people tossed coins. The cloak kept them from bouncing and rolling away to get lost in the sand. In those days, the good Jews on the way to Jerusalem would travel several miles out of the way in order to avoid having any contact with the Samaritans. They would cross the Jordan, go around by Petra, and then cross the Jordan again over by Jericho. From Jericho, they would take the steep road up to the city of Jerusalem, some 18 miles away. When the city fathers or the Chamber of Commerce took visitors around to see the sights of Jericho, they steered them away from this particular stretch of the road. The presence of a man in a tattered robe with a beggar's cloak, rattling his tin cup and begging for assistance, was not the image they wanted to promote for their fair city of palms. It was on this road outside of Jericho that Bartimaeus positioned himself for his daily routine of begging. As we walk through this story, I want you to first of all see the desperation of this man. The story begins in verse 46. Then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. It's interesting to me when Mark identifies this beggar, he gives his condition before his name. And even then, he doesn't really call his name. See, Bartimaeus isn't really a name. And the word, when it says a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, that word named is in italics, indicating that it isn't in the original manuscript, but it was added to try and provide clarity. In this case, I'm not sure, but what it makes it a little more confusing. See, the prefix bar means son of. So the writer is essentially saying, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, the son of Timaeus. He's identified by his condition, blind beggar, not his name. In addition, there's the meaning of the name Timaeus. This one's a little tricky. In Aramaic, Timaeus means defiled and unclean. In Greek, it means value and honor. Now, this is a little confusing. He's the son of defilement and dignity. It's confusing until you realize this could easily describe every one of us. See, we all have great worth, and we are all unworthy. Everyone matters to God, and everyone is messed up. Bartimaeus is the son of Timaeus, but his family is nowhere to be found. In this story, he's blind. Blindness was a very common problem in that day, and generally one who was blind was never healed. See, many thought blindness was a consequence of sin, and therefore the blind were often mistreated and marginalized. It is said by some that his father, Timaeus, was royalty or was in some high position, but when his son lost his eyesight, he was rejected and cast out from the family. We don't know what happened, but something tragic occurred in this man's life, and he lost his sight. Through no fault of his own, he's blind. Bartimaeus was one of society's expendables. He's on the bottom rung of the economic ladder, totally dependent upon everyone else. He's used to being ignored, used to being abused, used to being trampled on. He's an embarrassment to his family and even to his city. As far as Bartimaeus or anyone connected to him was concerned, his permanent lot in life was to sit by the side of the road on the outskirts of the city of Jericho and beg for sustenance. This day started out just like every other day before it, until suddenly he heard the sound of a large crowd of people coming from the city. He couldn't see what was going on, but he could hear the noise. As they got closer, he began trying to find out what was happening. No doubt most of the people just ignored him. They were too busy trying to get the best view. They were offended by the sight of this beggar in tattered garments on the side of the road. But their conversation was loud. Bartimaeus overheard somebody say something about Jesus of Nazareth traveling in the group. Hearing the name Jesus caused his ears to perk up. He couldn't see him, but he had heard about him. He had heard the reports of miracles he had performed. I mean, the lame walked, the lepers were cleansed, the deaf could hear, and most important for him, the blind could see. There was even talk that this was the long-awaited Messiah. I mean, his miracles certainly lined up with the prophet's words about the arrival of the Messiah in Isaiah 35:5, when it said, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped." When Bartimaeus heard it was Jesus passing by, he didn't sit back and say, "Well, I sure hope he comes over here and does something for me. I mean, I've had it so hard. Life just hasn't been fair to me all these years. I've been hurt, I've been abused, I've been ignored, I've been shunned. I've watched everybody else get their blessing. I think it's about time I got something." Oh no, he didn't do that. This was his chance for a change, and Bartimaeus seized the opportunity. And notice he didn't stop to compose a traditional prayer. He didn't think about whether or not people would appreciate his outburst. He didn't care if he caused a scene. He was a desperate man, and the only help he could ever hope to get was about to pass him by. Now was his chance. And I want you to notice, he didn't need a preacher to preach him happy. And he didn't need a choir to sing him happy. And he didn't need a deacon to pray him happy. And he didn't need a hymn of preparation or invitation. All he needed to know was that the living Word of God was near. He didn't have sight, but he had a voice. And with a cry born of desperation that began somewhere from deep within, he lifted up his voice and shouted, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Notice he wasn't saying, "Look here, Lord, I got some good qualities about me. I have a lot to offer. You could really use a guy like me on your team. Hey, Lord, do yourself a favor and come over here and you won't regret it." His was an anguished, desperate cry. "Oh, Lord, I'm messed up. I need mercy. This is personal. Have mercy on me. I heard about what you did for others, but Lord, I'm the one in need of your mercy. I'm the one needing help. It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Savior, Savior, hear my humble cry. While on others you are calling, do not pass me by." Oh no. I want to say to somebody that's in a desperate situation right now, maybe it's time for you to do something besides complain about your limitations. Here we have a nameless, blind beggar desperately crying out for mercy. And I want to tell you that you don't have to have a good name to call on the great name. You don't have to have good credit for him to hear your cry. You don't have to be morally perfect to call on his name. You don't have to be a Bible expert to call on his name. You don't have to come from the right family to call on his name. The prophet Joel said it, both Peter and Paul quoted it, "Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." When you're desperate, call on his name. When your resources are depleted, call on his name. When the prognosis is grim, call on his name. When everyone has forsaken you, call on his name. When the last ray of hope has disappeared, just call on his name. I'm talking to some people who are like this beggar. You're sitting by the roadside of life, desperate for help, desperate for change, but you don't have the power to change. You don't have the power to, see, I want to tell you, when you don't have the power to change, what's missing in your life isn't a personal trainer. You don't need more protein in your diet. See, your primary need isn't external power, it's internal power. You have mountains in your life that muscles can't move. You have problems in your life that arms can't lift and legs can't bear. So you don't need physical empowerment, you need spiritual empowerment. See, you don't need spiritual empowerment to cut your grass, but you may need it to stop smoking grass. You don't need spiritual empowerment to change your oil, but you need it to change your circumstances. You don't need spiritual power to make a baby, but you need it to parent a baby. You don't need spiritual empowerment to get married, but you need it to stay married. Come on, somebody. You don't need spiritual empowerment to fight, but you need it to forgive. You don't need spiritual empowerment to talk, but you need it to speak grace into somebody's life. You don't need spiritual empowerment to pray, but you need it to have your prayers answered. You don't need spiritual empowerment to diet, but you need it to make it into heaven. I'm here to tell somebody today, your condition doesn't have to be your conclusion. In your time of desperation, just call on his name. In this story, there's desperation. Then I want you to see there is determination. The Bible tells the reaction of the crowd to the desperate cry of Bartimaeus in verse 48. Many were sternly telling him to be quiet. Now that crowd wasn't going to do a thing for Bartimaeus, but they had the nerve to tell him to be quiet. Jesus doesn't have time for you, worthless beggar. You'll never amount to much of anything. Just be content with the help you've already received today. Hey, here's another $1 for your cup. Just quit all that yelling. We're trying to have a parade here, and you're ruining everything by your wailing. But Bartimaeus, this desperate man, had seized upon the opportunity and would not be denied. He was determined to get the attention of Jesus. See, he didn't know if he would ever get another chance like this one again. In fact, if he had waited for a more convenient time, he would have never received his miracle. Do you understand that? See, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem for the Passover. This is the last time he would travel this way, because when he gets to Jerusalem, Judas is going to betray him. The religious leaders are going to arrest him. The disciples are going to forsake him. The Romans are going to crucify him. Bartimaeus can't afford to wait until the next time, because there's not going to be a next time. For Bartimaeus, it's now or never. When the crowd told him to be quiet, the Bible says in verse 48, but he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, woo! Have mercy on me. I don't care if I'm making a spectacle of myself. I'm desperate. I don't care if this breaks with protocol. I'm desperate. I don't care what anybody says. I'm desperate. I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm desperate. You'll do crazy things when you're desperate. One of the reasons some of you haven't gotten any more from God than you've gotten is because of you haven't had that desperation yet. See, I'm desperate and I'm determined. If people in the crowd can hear me, then just maybe Jesus will hear me too. See, I hear he makes broken people whole, and I'm a prime candidate for wholeness. If he's looking to make somebody whole, he doesn't need to look any further than right here. And I'm not letting this crowd stand in the way of my wholeness. I'm not letting my pride stand in the way of my wholeness. I'm desperate and I'm determined to be made whole. I'm preaching to somebody. You've been praying for deliverance and it doesn't seem to be getting you anywhere. I'm here to tell you, pray one more time. Call out to Jesus one more time. Somebody needs the determination of Jacob in Genesis 32 and 26. I will not let you go until you bless me. You're right on the brink of your miracle. Hold on just a little longer. Cry out just a little louder. Get a bulldog grip on the promise of God and hold on. Refuse to give up. There's desperation, there's determination, and then finally I want you to see that there's deliverance. When Bartimaeus kept crying out, the Bible says in verse 49, and Jesus stopped. Now think about this. Jesus has a lot on his mind. He's on his way to Jerusalem where he's going to celebrate the Passover for the last time. In fact, he is going to be the Passover lamb that is sacrificed for the sin of the world. He's not going to be spared any pain, any agony, or any suffering. But when Jesus hears the desperate cry of a blind beggar that everybody else ignored and everybody else pushed to the side, when Jesus hears this cry, he stops and turns his attention to the person in need. I like to believe that when Jesus heard the cry of this man, he turned and saw Bartimaeus sitting by the side of the road. Bartimaeus didn't see Jesus, but Jesus saw him. You may be finding yourself sitting on the side of the road today through no fault of your own. It may seem like life is passing you by. It may be dark and bleak and smelly and dirty and dusty and uncomfortable and lonely and depressing. You may not be able to see Jesus, but Jesus is looking at you. See, the word of the Lord says in 2 Chronicles 16 and 9, for the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. We used to sing in old church, there's an all-seeing eye watching me. I'm telling you, he's watching you. He has his eyes on you. You may not be able to see him right now, but he's watching you. Your situation may seem hopeless. People may have told you to quit, to be quiet, to give up, to back down, move away, throw in the towel. But the Lord knows where you are. He's watching you. Jesus stopped. Then Jesus said, call him here. Now you would think, or I would think anyway, it would have been easier if Jesus had just walked over to where he was sitting. Instead, Jesus enlisted the people in the crowd to participate in the miracle. I'm just going to let that sit for a moment. See, you could be the one helping somebody to their miracle because Jesus wants to use you and work through you. I'd like to camp there for a little bit, but I got to move on. But Jesus said, call him here. Suddenly, the mood of the crowd changes in verse 49. Did you notice this? So they called to the blind man saying, take courage, stand up, he's calling for you. Are you kidding me? Are you serious? That same group that told him to close his mouth and be quiet is now saying, okay, cheer up. Jesus is calling for you. Here, let me help you over there. They forgot all the reasons they'd given him why he should have kept his mouth shut. Now, I know how some people would have reacted. I know how I would have wanted to react when the crowd suddenly changed their tune and started being all nice and lovey-dovey to me. Now that Jesus was paying some attention to him, the crowd changed their tone. Well, some of these guys, I probably would have wanted to do this. I would have turned my attention to the crowd and started blasting them and taking them to task for trying to keep me from my audience with Jesus. Yeah, you got a lot of nerve trying to keep me away from Jesus. I see what you're doing. I would listen. Ignore the crowd. Just ignore the crowd. Haters gonna hate. So don't resort to getting down to their level. You just keep your eyes on Jesus. You just keep your eyes on Jesus. See, Bartimaeus didn't wait for the crowd to help him. Verse 50 tells his response. Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. Oh, there's so much here. I hope I can unpack it for you the way I understand it. Because if you're not careful, you'll just read past the part about him throwing aside his cloak. And if you do, you'll miss a significant detail. There's a reason why Mark says throwing aside his cloak. See, that cloak, that's his old identity. This is the trappings of his old life as a blind beggar. This is his security. That cloak is what gives him the legal right to beg. This is what keeps him warm at night. There was probably some money in that cloak from where he had been begging all morning. And when Bartimaeus throws off his cloak, he's saying, Jesus is calling for me, so I'm not going to need this anymore. Things are going to be different from now on. I'm expecting things to change. I asked you at the beginning to tell somebody I'm expecting God to do something for me. I want to tell you that expectation is the breeding ground for miracles. And when Jesus calls you, you don't have to be identified with the way you used to be any longer. When Jesus calls you, you don't have to trust in the arm of the flesh. See, what Bartimaeus lacked in eyesight, he made up for in insight. He threw aside that cloak because he didn't want anything tripping him up on his way to his miracle. He threw aside his cloak because he didn't want to be wrapped up in the past. He threw aside his cloak because he wasn't planning on going back to the way it used to be. He threw aside his cloak because he had to let go of some stuff in order to embrace the blessing God had for his life. See, he knew that when he got to Jesus, his life would never be the same again. He knew that when he got to Jesus, he would never again need to use the things he used to use for survival. He knew that he was going to see and he would never need to beg again. The casting off of that cloak was a demonstration of faith and trust, and it became a proclamation of expectation that a miracle was on its way. Now, the Bible says not only that he threw aside his cloak, but that he jumped up and came to Jesus. Have you ever wondered how he got to Jesus? I mean, he couldn't see. And for all their sweet words, I somehow don't think anybody in the crowd actually took him by the hand and led him. I can't prove it from the text. But I suspect he got to Jesus the same way you will get to Jesus. He followed the sound of his voice. Jesus commanded and Bartimaeus obeyed. He didn't make any excuse for his inability, because what Jesus commands, Jesus enables. The master calls and Bartimaeus comes. The old paths are forsaken. He leaves behind the thing in which he trusted for so long in order to step into the realm of possibility opened by the command of Jesus to come. Bartimaeus gets to Jesus, and Jesus asks him in verse 51, "What do you want me to do for you?" First time I read that, I thought, well, that is a stupid question. What do you mean, what do you want me to do for you? It seems like a strange question, but maybe not when you understand the context of the story. See, if you back up in this chapter, all the way back to verse 2 of this chapter, what the Pharisees they wanted to outsmart and trap Jesus. A little bit later in the chapter, when the rich man was asked that question in verse 17, he wanted eternal security at minimum cost. Later on in verses 35 and 36, James and John wanted to be the top officials in the kingdom bureaucracy. So now here comes a blind beggar, and he might have said, "You know, Jesus, I've fallen on some hard times financially. Do you think you could make a sizable donation to my cup?" That's all some folks would ever ask for. I just want things to be a little better, a little easier. Not this blind beggar. He wants a radical transformation. He said in verse 51, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." Now think about that. If he wants to regain his sight, that means he used to be able to see. He had lost something that he wanted back. He didn't act like it was okay with not having it and just things getting a little easier in his present. Oh, no. He wanted it all back. He's not just asking for sight, he's asking for restoration. Are you hearing me? Are you getting this? He's not just asking for things to get a little easier as a beggar. Oh, no. He says, I want a complete overhaul here. The Bible says in verse 52, Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." That word is sozo. It's saved you. It's made you whole. Immediately, he regained his sight and began following him on the road. And it just seems to me that I hear the Lord saying to somebody today, take courage, stand up, I'm calling for you. Can you hear him? This probably isn't a message for everybody, but it is for somebody. It's for somebody who will hear the Master's voice, not my voice. It's not what I'm saying, but while I'm saying it, you're sensing something on a far deeper level. You're sensing the Spirit of the Lord speak to your heart right now. And you're hearing the Master's voice calling for you to come. Take courage. Stand up. I'm calling for you. I'm preaching to somebody who is ready to recover what has been lost. Somebody is ready to reclaim what the enemy has stolen. I want to tell you today, it's time to reclaim your peace. It's time to reclaim your joy. It's time to reclaim your hope. It's time to reclaim your family. It's time to reclaim your dream. It's time to reclaim your victory. It's time to take back that which you've lost through no fault of your own. The Lord says, what do you want? I believe if Bartimaeus had said, I'd just like a couple $100 extra here, that would have been all he got. Remember, the Bible says you have not because you ask not. Would you dare to believe God for something bigger than anything you could do for yourself? The Lord's calling for those who are desperate. And you're calling out to Jesus. Don't let anyone or anything hinder you. Lay aside your old past. Lay aside your pride. Lay aside your past in order to embrace the possibility of a new tomorrow. Lay aside your fear. He's calling for you to come. Lay aside your guilt. He's calling for you to come. Lay aside your shame. He's calling for you to come. Lay aside your doubt. He's calling for you to come. Lay aside your old habits. He's calling for you to come. Lay aside your preconceived ideas of how everything ought to be accomplished. He's calling for you to come. Lay aside your old tattered garment of how it's always been. He's calling for you to come and experience how it's going to be. I want to know if I'm talking to anybody who's really desperate for the help of the Lord today. Is there anybody who's ready for a change? Anybody who's ready to take back what the enemy has stolen and reclaim your lost heritage? Anybody who's ready for the miracle dynamic of the Lord to break in on your life? I'm telling you, the Lord is in the midst of his people right now. Hear him calling to you. Don't be afraid. Take courage. Stand up. Come to the Master. Come with expectation that your life will never again be the same.